He was the man from Missouri, a farmer's son who fought in World War I and married the first girl he ever loved. Harry Truman was perceived by many as honest and moral. As president, Truman kept a sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." He also displayed a quote by Mark Twain. "Always do right," it read. "This will gratify some people and astonish the rest."
My choice early in life was either to be a piano player in a whorehouse or a politician. And to tell the truth, there's hardly a difference.
Truman grew up in Independence, Missouri. He wore glasses, and to avoid breaking them, obediently refrained from outdoor games, turning instead to quieter pursuits, such as practicing the piano and reading books. His favorites profiled historical figures, and he soon came to admire the likes of Hannibal and Robert E. Lee. Also in his mind was Bess Wallace, a classmate he met in Sunday school. As a young man, Truman courted her persistently, proposing twice before she accepted in 1917. They wed 2 years later and would have a daughter, Margaret. The year of his wedding, Truman was 35 and had yet to find his niche in life. He'd already been a farmer, a railroad timekeeper, a bank clerk, and a volunteer officer in the First World War. Along the way, an unlucky business investment had cost him dearly, and his new clothing store would go under in 3 years, leaving him in severe debt. But such setbacks challenged Truman, whose tenacity grew from a belief in his own success. "I've always had a sneaking notion that someday, maybe, I'd amount to something," he once wrote Bess. The year his store closed, Truman was elected a Missouri County judge. It was an entry into public service that, in his own words, quote, "just happened." But it was facilitated by the backing of a Missouri political mentor named Thomas Pendergast, whose support also helped Truman land a seat in the U.S. Senate 12 years later, in 1934. Truman enjoyed the boisterous nature of the Senate. "If you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen," he liked to say. His enthusiasm sometimes got the better of him, however, and he would later become known for his feisty spirit and salty language. Truman displayed his fiery side the day he learned of President Roosevelt's wish to make him his running mate in the 1944 election. Reluctant to leave the Senate, Truman declared, "Tell him to go to hell." He eventually relented, however, and the next November was elected vice president, serving 3 months before Roosevelt died.
When they told me what had happened, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me.
After Roosevelt's death, he learned about the atomic bomb, a weapon he'd use 4 months later to precipitate the end of World War II. Truman worked hard to steer the nation into the post-war era, but his popularity dropped from 90% in August of 1945 to 34% by September of 1946. People joked that to err was Truman, and observed that if a man like Harry Truman could become president, anybody could. That didn't stop him from seeking a return to the Oval Office in 1948. By that time, a Republican victory seemed so imminent that Truman's own mother-in-law considered his chances slim. But the odds were familiar ones to Truman, whose subsequent defeat of Republican Thomas Dewey would become one of the biggest political upsets in American history. His second term, marked by American intervention in Korea and mounting tensions with the Soviet Union, was more challenging than his first, and Truman's approval ratings again began to sink. He declined to seek re-election in 1952 and left office the following year. Truman returned to Independence, where he began work on his memoirs. He also lectured at universities and traveled the country stumping for the Democrats. In retirement, he refused to profit personally through speaking or consulting fees, noting that as president, he'd tried never to forget who he was and where he was returning. He died the day after Christmas in 1972, at age 88.
Peace, my friend, is the goal of my public life. I'd rather have a lasting peace in the world than to be President of the United States.